Hildy is a bawdy, chain-smoking, 70-something former journalist who lives on the Upper West Side in an apartment that has a portal back to 1973. Time travel has rules, though, and Hildy breaks them by traveling back with healthcare aide Trista. Now both women will have to come to terms with their pasts before they lose their chance at having a future. From Ahoy Comics comes Alisa Whitney's Guilt. That's Gilt, a comic book that's Sex and the City meets the Golden Girls by way of the Twilight Zone. Call your local comic book store and ask them to order your copy of Guilt today. Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm writer, story expert, and Dream Vortex, Lonnie Diane Rich.
And I'm writer, erstwhile DC Comics editor, and something unspeakably nasty in the sub-basement, Alisa Whitney. Today on Endless, we're going to be talking about The Doll's House, issue 10 of the comic and the beginning of a 7-part storyline from the Sandman. It was originally collected and released in trade paperback just after issue 16 hit the stands.
The Doll's House was written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Mike Dringenberg and Malcolm Jones III. Zylanol was the colorist and Todd Klein did the lettering. Covers by Dave McKean. Karen Berger was the editor and Art Young was associate editor.
I am 1 and 3 and many, but that was the wrong question, child. Time to wake up.
All right, everybody, before we begin this week, a few things are changing here on Endless. Like everything that we do here at Chipperish Media, we are building the train track as the train is coming, trying to figure out what the best way is to do things. So, first, we're going from 2 issues per episode of Endless to 1. This allows us to dive deeper, talk more about the art, and just not rush through this whole narrative experience. You'll see those changes reflected in the online calendar, which you can click to see via your show notes. But now that we're only doing 1 issue per episode, it'll be a little easier to know what we're doing every week because it is whatever the next issue is. Second, our numbering system has gone from this very complicated kind of TV series like volume number and title with the issue number and the title to just Sandman, the issue number, and the title. So originally we had this whole complicated, we're doing Sandman Volume 2, The Doll's House, Issue 2, The Doll's House, to Sandman Issue 10, The Doll's House. The world benefits from simplicity. You are welcome. All right, Alisa, what did you think about The Doll's House?
What I really enjoy about The Doll's House is how we start with this kind of Game of Thrones feeling of royal siblings plotting against siblings. And then there's this switch of tone into a very down-to-earth 21-year-old who's a bit snarky and very relatable. And then again, we take a detour into the dreaming for some slapstick and cute critters with a hint of something darker. And I just really enjoyed the way there's all these lovely shifts. It reminds me of those great old rock songs like No Sugar Tonight. I had to look up No Sugar Tonight by the Guess Who. You know how that song sort of starts being one song and then it segues into another and then everything all comes together and it's a complex bouquet of harmonies and I like it.
Yeah. I like it. I mean, it's a hell of a start, right? We get this 1 issue. We meet desire and despair. There's world building there. We get Rose and Miranda and Unity. So that's a story into itself. We've got Rose's dreaming and that the dreaming is all weird and there's things happening. Jed's name is dropped a few times. Apparently we have Chekhov's younger missing brother going on there. And, you know, some entities are missing from the dream world. So there's another narrative line. You know, and something called the Corinthian is evil and out. So we know we have to deal with that. This is a lot of starter gun narrative kind of packed into 1 issue. And I find that really interesting. We do hop from tone to tone to tone, from flavor to flavor to flavor, and pull it all together through. Now, how we see all of that move through the rest of this series is going to be really interesting to see. But it's a hell of a starter gun.
It is indeed. And I think that the Corinthian is just going to be a really interesting character, as we will see.
All right. Well, don't make us wait anymore. Give us that summary.
We open the doll's house with a splash page. Desire's enormous fortress known as the Threshold, which was one of the early contenders for a name for the Vertigo imprint, but that's another story. In this story, we see the Natalie-suited Desire make their way through a gallery, where we see an Ankh, a book, and Dream's mask. Desire removes a ring with a fishhook and kisses it, explaining that they hold their sister's sigil, traditionally a symbol used to summon a deity, and requests that their twin Despair come join them. We learn that Despair and Desire are younger siblings and that there is a missing prodigal, and that Desire was definitely behind the whole Nada fiasco. Now Desire has a new plot to screw with Dream, and it involves a woman who is a dream vortex. Back in the waking world, we meet Rose, a baby-faced 21-year-old with a punkish streak in her blonde hair and personality. Hey, back in the 90s, a streak of pink was considered punkish. Rose and her mother Miranda have been given free tickets to England by a mysterious female benefactor who turns out to be Unity Kincaid, Miranda's biological mother and Rose's grandmother. Still living in the nursing home, all she has left of the world she once knew is a doll's house, which is where we can spot Morpheus, observing with the hint of a smile and the glint of a star reflected in his eye. Unity gifts Rose with a ring. But this family reunion has some sinister overtones. In the dreaming, Lucien the librarian takes a census and discovers that 4 of the major arcana are missing: Brute and Glob, the Corinthian, whom we are about to meet, and Fiddler's Green. We learn that Rose is a lucid dreamer who is observing all this, and is observed in turn by Morpheus and Lucien. There is another hint as to what makes Rose special when she opens a door in the nursing home and runs into the 3 witches who have come to warn her in maddeningly elliptical terms about the dangers she is about to face. They mention Rose's missing brother Jed, Morpheus, and the escaped nightmare called the Corinthian. Rose wonders who the Corinthian is, and we get a glimpse of him at work and play as he holds a knife over a bound young sex worker named Davy in a Texas motel room. The issue, which began with desire, ends on a note of despair.
All right, Alisa. So, wow, the doll's house packed full of just stuff happening. But let's go ahead and start talking about the art and Dave McKean's cover work.
I think the covers are really interesting to bring into the discussion because, you know, if you were teaching literature in a college course, you would talk about symbolism. And a lot of the symbols of these stories get collected in the cover. So we begin with a new cover design. And, you know, the amount of change that there is in the Sandman covers was really, I think, a fairly new phenomenon. I don't, again, I am not an expert, so I don't know if Sandman was the first or among the first to really have different storylines, have such different designs to the covers. But with this new storyline, we've got sort of a ripped frame with the jagged edges stained blood red, and they frame an anguished but lovely androgynous face. There's a hint of blonde hair. I believe this is Rose. The figure is shrouded in a lot of shadow, though, so there's ambiguity. There's always ambiguity. And there's a cross earring that we can see in one ear, and other crosses in the design. I don't know if these are symbolic of crosses as in Christianity or crosses as in a crossroads. And I kind of suspect the latter. There are also a bunch of fishing lures, and the filaments remind me, at least, of a puppet strings, which are symbols of Dream's cruelest sibling, Desire. And of course, the fish hooks are also symbols of despair.
Oh my God. Yeah. Despair in that opening sequence with Desire and Despair. And you see Despair with the face of a baby, you know, like with a really baby-like face, just cutting herself while they talk. That is, I mean, that's an image that is going to stick with me for a while, because there is the element, and this is one of the amazing things, like when you think about what the art represents and what these choices, that these aren't random choices. These are things that have meaning. And the idea that despair, like to go fishing for something, is to go hunting for something, is to look for it, is to want it. And for despair to not resist, but rather actively hunt down the source of her own despair, I think is so fascinating and interesting and not entirely unlike humanity. So I really dig that they've got that kind of, it could have been anything that she was cutting her face with, but the idea that it was this barbed fish hook, the thing we use to find something, to reach something, to get something, you know, I love it.
I think it's hadn't thought before about the symbolism of the fish hook, but it's also one of those kinds of barbs that gets caught in you and you can't get it out without doing more damage to yourself.
Yep. Yeah. Oh my God. There's so much in there that I absolutely love. All right. So did you have anything else about the art that you wanted to look at?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that, different artists, we will see as the series goes on and we have more artists contributing their talents, that different artists bring different gifts to the table. And Neil has a real skill for tuning the story to that musician's frequency, as it were. But Dringenberg and Malcolm Jones III together, I think, are such a great team for bringing something that is gritty and realistic and yet beautiful. So you get a lot of punkish grittiness, you get real world stuff that feels terrifying and yet has this really aesthetic beauty to it. And they also work very well between the beauty of the dreaming and the real world. So I think that's, I was thinking about how when we start to see Morpheus as the young rock star and see that sort of sexual side of him, which is reflected in the storylines and in our knowledge now that he's had this bruising, awful love affair, that we have him, this variant of him that is, I think, a little bit more of a sexual variant, than Sam Keith's earlier version, which had, other charms and appeal. But the fact that this is a storyline that's going to take us into discussion of sex and cruelty and darkness and desire, it just feels like this is such a good art team for that.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I do love the way too that like the art style will vary based on the tone that we're in, that there is a toning to the way the colors are used, to the way the lines are drawn. And again, like I am not a visual person. I am not an art person. It's not that I don't like art. It's that I just simply don't have like the language really to think. I think about things in terms of movement and character and story, and visuals always end up on the back end for me. Which is what I really love about doing these, is that it's really forcing me to kind of like exercise that part of my brain. So I'm going to say a lot of things about the art that probably are not very smart, but I'm learning. I'm like working my way into this. But but there is like, as far as like the colors that are chosen and the palette that are chosen for various different places and the way that things look, and Lucien, when he's going through the various spaces in the dreaming, we get that toning in each one of these little slivers of the dreaming as he's going through and like counting all of it, doing the census. And I love the way that this team moves from one kind of art, because the art that we see, especially the art style that despair has, is different from the art style that desire has, and they're in the same page. They're in the page together, and yet there's a difference in that style, and it does speak to the way that despair feels different from desire. It's so interesting. I'm just so fascinated.
That's a really interesting observation. And I think you're right. There is something perhaps even a little more realistic that comes across in despair. And Desire gets a little bit more of a stylized, almost like a fashion illustration.
Yes.
I hadn't thought of that. And there's that moment when Lucienne looks and sees Rose the Dreamer, and suddenly it is one of the more realistic renderings. So yeah, there's just a lot going on, and I also really love the movement. There are times when you kind of turn the page sideways because of the way things are arranged, and
oh God, and the able sequence that makes that J shape as it moves through. And it does. That's what dreams do, right? They turn you sideways a little bit.
I love that. Yeah. There's a playfulness, sometimes a sinister playfulness, but
it's very, very cool. And it feels, and pardon me again for using a term from like another, like, I think of like jazz and like the improvisational way that jazz works. And I want to use the word scatological, that there's like all of these things contribute. And again, I don't know what I'm like pulling stuff out of nowhere.
I think you mean like scatting in jazz, but scatological I think means like
it's different.
Poopy talk.
Oh, is that what that is?
I'm afraid
I don't know.
so.
Scatological sounds a lot smarter. But yeah, what I'm talking about is like scat in jazz, which again, I know nothing about. So pardon me while I lay out my ignorance for everybody who listens. You're welcome. But yeah, like that kind of, there'll be something that almost sounds dissonant, within like that jazz kind of thing. And then somebody will take it and pull it back in and weave it into the rest of the piece, so that even though some things feel like they don't belong, they all weave in together really nicely. And I really like that. Yeah.
And there's that improvisational quality that comes when people are creating on a deadline. And we're talking about this as though, everyone had all the time in the world to create. But this was a monthly book. So everyone was, do it, finish it, turn it in. And
make a thing and go on. Yeah.
Casablanca was like that. Actually, Casablanca was done in an incredibly short amount of time.
Yeah, it's crazy when you think about the way that things used to be done, like, what a film schedule was back then as opposed to now. It's nuts. All right, so let's get into the story a little bit. Here we are, like we met Unity at the beginning, and now she's coming back in here. And it's really interesting. We see in this story, like a lot of things that are pulled from, Neil references things outside and references the long history of DC and pulls in characters. In the bonus episode with Joshua Unruh, we talked a little bit about all those characters that were being pulled in. And here he is now referencing himself.
Yeah, one of the things that makes Neil's world, the Sandman world, feel so solidly built is how he will pull at a thread that, was mentioned earlier on and just weaves it through. And, we back in Sleep of the Just, Unity was a teenage sleeper who couldn't waken. We're told that after her parents died, she was placed in this nursing home. So now we're meeting her as an old woman. But as she says to 21-year-old Rose, in some ways, I'm younger than you. She's had 17 years of life experience, and she's still surprised to see that she looks old, which I can completely relate to now.
I know that feeling. Yes, when you look in the mirror, you're like, "Hey, Mom, how are you?" Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about the Sandman is, yes, there are so many strands that get picked up and woven through, but not all. I do not think that the bottle imp that is mentioned ever, I don't remember any stories. Josh Unruh is probably going to come back and say, no, the bottle imp appeared, but I'm not remembering the bottle imp.
Right, yeah.
Which doesn't mean that the bottle imp may not yet have its day in the sun. But the idea that there are so many nooks and crannies and places to explore in this huge world that we're not going to get all of them is also part of the brilliant scaffolding.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does. I mean, it gives you this sense of this greater, grander world. If all you create is the stuff that you're going to actually do something with, I think it gives a story a claustrophobic sense. You know, it feels closed in. And I think that there can be stories where that works, you know, where the claustrophobia, you want that very, very close feeling. But in Sandman, it's the opposite of that. There is a world that just expands in every direction you look, and it expands and expands and expands, you know, and not everything is going to be pulled in. Not everything is going to be used, you know, but that does make you feel like if you were to just go off the track and wander a little bit, that there would be things there waiting for you, you know?
There is an author, oh gosh, and I'm blanking on his name. I think there is a protagonist named Thursday in it. And
Thursday Next, Jasper Ford, the
yes,
airfare?
Yes. So in those, you know, every book is a world, but the only geography that exists are the places and locations that have been laid out. So, you know, in Jane Austen, you can have Bath and London, perhaps, but not much else. Yeah. There's no Wales. Yeah. There's no Scotland. And, you know, so there's, I think this would be a fairly large playground. Some of the things and characters here are being pulled in from actually the real world. And I love the character of Fiddler's Green. I remember finding out when I think Neil just said, you know, oh yes, Fiddler's Green is based on G.K. Chesterton. So G.K. Chesterton was, I think he was a contemporary of Oscar Wilde's and Hilaire Belloc, a bunch of other folks. He died in 1936. And he really looked exactly like that picture of Gilbert. His name was Gilbert Keith, G.K. Chesterton. And he was just an enormously clever person. I looked up some of his quotes. My old friend, Bob Morales, who is also a friend of Neil's and also a great writer, gave me his book, The Man Who Was Thursday. And I don't know if it was from this book, but there was a quote, "The traveler sees what he sees, the tourist sees what he has come to see." And anyway, Neil was a big fan. I think he read G.K. Chesterton's books when he was in school as a kid. And so the idea that he brought him in as a character, but sort of crossed G.K. Chesterton with Fiddler's Green, which is a paradise that's specific to mariners, to, I guess, people who worry that they, you know, if you're worried that you might perish at sea, it's lovely to have this idea that you will go to a wonderful land when you're done with this mortal coil. So I think that is just a cool thing that I'm giving a shout out to.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, it's a minor spoiler for something that's to come. At this point, we've mentioned Fiddler's Green, but we haven't really talked about any of that. So that's going to be very interesting when we kind of get to that a little bit later. But yeah, I love that. The G.K. Chesterton reference in that was very, very cool. I like that a lot. One of the things that I found really interesting in this from like a narrative perspective is this sort of trope. And okay, I'm going to use the word trope because what it means is it's just something that is a repeated sort of device in writing. And they're not all bad. A lot of people say tropes because they don't like the fact that, you know, not everything is a frickin' surprise. Not everything should be in writing. And that's a whole long thing. If you want to hear about that, I've ranted about that on a million other things. We don't always need a surprise. We don't always need a twist. But this trope is the chosen one trope, the special one, you know, and it's a flavor of character that is a lot of fun to work with. And I've always wanted to kind of write a character like this. I've never really gotten to it because it's really difficult to pull off. Because what we want in a protagonist is somebody who is actively in pursuit of a goal. But these people are by definition selected. They are not choosing, they are chosen, you know, and the difference, like the choice that characters make, the choices that they make, the things that they chase, that's what defines characters. These people are not chasing anything. Often their only goal is to survive whatever horror is trying to kill them because they are the chosen. And because that, it makes it really hard to write these characters. Your Harry's Potter, your Buffy's Summers, they don't act, they are acted upon. It's just a huge, huge challenge. And I see Rose coming in, kind of being one of these characters. She is the vortex, but this is not through any choice of her own. This is not something she chased down. She did not want to become a vortex. She just wanted to take a nap. She wanted to take a nap on a plane like a normal person, and then all this shit started happening to her, And one of the things that happens, especially when we have young girls as our chosen ones, is that they often sort of bounce around at the whim of fate. They don't direct their own stories. And I think some of that comes from culturally. We have issues with seeing women as directors of their own fate. Harry Potter does a little bit better. And Buffy Summers does pretty well. Buffy, of course, if you guys have not seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer, A, what have you been doing for the last 20 years? And B, go listen to my podcast, Still Pretty, because I'll walk you through the whole thing. It's amazing. But they can be really challenging to write. And here we have a Rose appears to be the central character, definitely like central to this issue. And I find it interesting once again that we have Sandman comic in which Sandman does not appear to be our protagonist. So that's really interesting. We open up, the only one in this opening episode that is actively trying to do something is Desire. Because Desire is like, well, there's a vortex, it's a woman, so that's going to be a thing. And we sit and we wait. We are endless, are we not? Yes, we wait, which I love. I love that. So I find that really interesting, that Desire is after something. And to me, it feels like if they can get Dream to feel Desire to want something, then that's some kind of victory for them. I don't know. The family relationships here are so interesting, and I have just barely scratched the surface, I know, on getting into that. That is fascinating. So we've got, Desire probably with a goal. Dream's got something he's chasing because he just wants to know who's there and who's missing, from the dreaming after all of this time, and he gets the senses. So he's kind of got something. But mostly Rose is being acted upon. This thing is happening to her. Even finding her grandmother was not something she went after. That happened also to her. We keep going back to Jed. Chekhov's younger brother who is missing, and we don't know what's going to happen, but clearly we keep mentioning this Jed. We know something's going to be happening with that. So I find this very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how Neil executes that kind of character, because it is so incredibly challenging.
I have always thought of tropes as being like the required moves in figure skating. Mm-hmm. And, so they are there to sort of show your skill at executing these, prescribed maneuvers. And if you're really artistic, you can so work them into your routine that it looks like, oh, I just really wanted to do a double axel right there, instead of, oh, I got to get this double axel out. And so I enjoy a trope, and I really enjoy it if someone can convince me that they just
can do it.
Yeah, needed to do that double axel. Yeah. I was just thinking that Ted Lasso is like, this wonder. I'm late to the Ted Lasso gang.
I was too. I got about a month ago, and I love it so much. I've watched it like 4 times.
Because it executes every trope, just so.
It does it well.
So well.
Yeah.
But to go back to Rose as a chosen one, so this was pre-Buffy.
Yeah.
And I remember, just the idea that this young but, snarky and relatable woman was a dream vortex just made her seem very relatable to me. So I identified with her. And, I think her goal in the beginning is just, not to get sucked into the weirdness. She's going to have other goals. But there's, you will see in the course of this storyline that a woman who seems passive and lacking in agency can become someone who will tell Morpheus that he's a bit slow. But even that statement of mine is slightly misleading. So I will leave that at that. Oh, I had one other thing that I wanted to say. So Desire is setting something up, and I am not clever enough. I would never have seen this the first, second, or third time. But there are clues in here about what Desire is up to, and they're really hard to I don't think, you can easily solve this, but the three witches are definitely there as a clue. And once you have read the entire series, you will be like, oh, witches. Oh, yeah.
I get it. Oh, yay. I love that. That's exciting. So the story structure here, I mean, also is really interesting. These issues are being put together with a structure. Not every single one, but a lot of them have this. A lot of them open with a cold open is what they call it in TV. I don't know. Do they call it that in comics? Where we open the comic, page one is not a title page. It doesn't give us the whole thing, but it kind of like sets the tone for what's going to be happening here. So we have a little cold open. Then we have the title page, in which we get some story happening, but we also get all of our credits and everything and what the title of the issue is. And then we go through our story movements, and then we have a little coda at the end, a little coda that is not necessarily part of this story, but a hint of what is to come in later stories. And this is a really fun, kind of structure to have. Like, I like that as an episodic story structure, because I feel like even though all of these episodes, and especially in Sandman, every issue kind of will have a different flavor, but this structure sort of unites it all the way through. And as somebody who worked on it, and I know you weren't working on it back then, but I'm curious, like, is that kind of a standard structure style for comics? Is this something that Neil sort of brought into these, or I mean, do you have any sense of that?
I think that a lot of the earlier comics were more straightforward in their structure. You would start with some of the other. I'm just trying to think. Maybe you would start with a crime, and then you get the detective coming in with superheroes, and yeah, I think that sometimes you might start with the crime and then have the superhero come in, or sometimes you'd start right with the protagonist. Sandman is really much more of an ensemble than most comics that I'd encountered in the past. So, I mean, I used to read superhero and anthology and love comics. And, if we're talking about superhero comics, they were much more protagonist or team driven. I didn't know all of these terms back in the 90s of cold open. I have since learned them. I don't know if Neil was aware of them and had studied, TV scripting, or if this just came instinctively. I have a funny feeling that it might have been an instinctive way of approaching the story at a slightly more oblique angle, catching you and bringing you in a less straightforward way. And, I think when I think of the kind of TV shows that have cold opens, they certainly the most straightforward sitcoms did not. I don't, All in the Family and Maude didn't have a cold open. They just started with whatever their situation was. So I think this perhaps, there's elements of thriller and mystery that are in Sandman, and so maybe that is what the connection is in part.
I think it's interesting. It's definitely a structure that I think works really well for this particular kind of story. It's funny because the coda in TV is something that you'd see sometimes. It would be the kind of thing that would come in and we'd have like a cliffhanger, where, oh my goodness, what happened? Who shot JR? That kind of stuff, And I prefer a coda in which, like what Neil's doing here, where we don't know Davy and we don't know the Corinthian at the end. Like, we're not invested in either of them. At the end, the difference between like I talk about the difference between a cliffhanger and a game changer. A cliffhanger is where like, I don't know, you don't know what happens. And then a lot of times you'll tune back in only to find out it was not as big a deal as they made it out to be or whatever. It's almost always disappointing. It's kind of a cheap device. Game changer is when something happens and you know what happens, but because of what happened, everything's different. And you have to start, like, you throw everything out. The whole world has changed because of that. I love a game changer. This coda probably, because we don't know what happens to Davy, but we know what happens to Davy. Like, we don't see what happens to Davy, but we know what happens to Davy. So I would not call it like a cliffhanger type of thing. But what it is it's just this little vignette. And I love a coda like this, like a little vignette that's just like, here's a taste of what is happening, like the kinds of things that we're going to be dealing with in the process of these stories. And I love that use of a coda, that is something like, here we have two characters. We're not involved in the rest of the story. They're not winding up anything that happened in the story that we have so far. They don't seem directly related, except that, the Corinthian was mentioned, so we do some reference of that. But yeah, but to have that little coda at the end and then to open with the cold open, which is desire and despair. And then I love your connection that the coda ends in despair. Like, there, in the beginning, we have the anthropomorphized, vision of despair. And here we have what that character is anthropomorphizing, the concept of despair, the experience of despair. I absolutely love that. Now that you pulled that in, I liked this coda already, but now I like it even more.
Oh, I want to, you're making, I love it when you say things that make me can make connections that I hadn't previously made. One of I taught a graphic novel writing course at Fordham a bunch of years ago. And I had one student who originally had his hero, I think his hero beat up someone who was weaker than him. And I said, here's the problem. He now seems like the bad guy. And the student said, no, because this is what happened to the hero. This is what the weaker person did to the hero. And I said, yeah, but we are only told about that. And we are shown the hero retaliating. And if I were to say to you, Dirk Blurg was the cruelest man in the world, and he had, used to, I don't know, bite the heads off snakes. And then you see Dirk rescuing a kitten. You are going to now see Dirk as a good guy. So what we are shown really always trumps what we are told about a character. Yes. And so we've been told that the Corinthian is a nightmare. We've been told that he's a major arcana. But when we see, even though we don't see graphically, we see enough of what he's doing, what he's going to do, that he registers differently with us.
Oh, absolutely. I love that. I love that structure. I love the way it pulls it together. I love the way it harmonizes that, even though every issue is different, and may have a different kind of flavor, different tone to it, we still have that structure that kind of unites it. It's really, really beautiful. So desire and despair. Opening with these two endless, and we're seeing, so far we've got dream, we've got death, we've seen, now we've got desire and despair. We open with this unbelievable world building about, a desire lives within a small chamber of the heart of this fortress that is desire, and that it's, you could walk the aorta for days and never be in the same place twice. Like, it was just like the description of that was really phenomenal. And then we got all of these sigils on the wall, all of these representations. We see desire kind of, look at the mask that represents dream and sort of smirk at it. And, almost like, your time will come, darling, and then when despair shows up, they talk about somebody who is missing. And the first instance is, that's Dream, because Dream was missing. Now there's somebody else who was missing, an older brother. And we get a sense of the older three, which I presume is Death and Dream, and then the one who is still missing, I'm guessing, from all of these little hints where I'm like, I want the endless story. I want to know what's going on with that. So I'm really excited to like get more drips and drabs of all of these relationships as they go. Or the prodigal has returned is what it is, right? We think it's Dream, but it's not Dream. So that's really interesting. And you don't have to answer that.
I don't think the missing sibling is one of the three eldest. I may be wrong here. I think that if you look at the sigils, so there's
the Ankh for death.
That is the Ankh for death. There is the helm of Sandman's helm. That's Dream, and the book, belongs to Destiny.
Destiny. Okay. Yeah, I hadn't put all that together. I was just looking at it and I was like, So I'm so interested in all of these things. I love the sigil when people had to communicate before everybody had a smartphone. Like they've had all of these years of human history that they've had to try to communicate, and they have the sigils. I think that's awesome. But it's so 2 pages, fascinating artwork, so interesting. The fishhook, so gross and weird and disturbing, and yet unbelievably anchored in symbolism and importance and almost the love affair with despair, which is so interesting. Despair's love affair with herself. God, I love it. It's so cool.
I also think it's interesting that despair is allowed to not be conventionally beautiful. She is, you could, just on the face of it, despair could have been some pre-Raphaelite Ophelia-looking chick. And so it's an interesting choice to make despair, not conform to that. And I'll be intrigued to see how that plays out, especially with all the nudity. She's always nude in the TV series.
That'll be really interesting.
Do we know?
It would be really interesting to see. Yeah.
Do we know who's playing Despair yet?
I don't. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it would be neat to see. The bodies that we typically see on television are a very particular kind of body. So it would be interesting to see some diversity in body shape as far as, and especially if we've got somebody who is constantly nude, to see that done in a way where it's not being represented as gross. Anybody who is not a size 0 is grossly obese, right? It's just kind of the way that things tend to be presented. So that'll be really interesting. And as we talk about diversity, here in 1990, 1991, whenever this was, here we have a character who is gender fluid. Someone who goes, from one place to another, who is in the spectrum of gender, who feels themselves in the spectrum of gender, pronouns of they, them, right? This is, I looked a little bit ahead, and I believe that we are using proper they pronouns throughout the whole thing. And I think that is, it's really nice to see. And even though, there's some issues that do happen with queer characters, with evil characters, with villains being queer coded, and this doesn't feel like that to me, we can have people from all kinds of, the idea that anybody who is underrepresented in our stories has to be perfect and beyond reproach and all of that is almost as insulting, as anything else. It's just as flat, to have somebody with desires, incredible power, because let's not forget that the one sibling that Death and Dream talk about when they're not there, it's fucking desire. Like, desire is on everybody's head all the time. Desire is so incredibly important. And I kind of love this. This feels, it feels very like, for something that's, 30 years old, it feels very of the time now.
It does. Although there's always been, without the language of gender fluidity, I think there have always been, especially among performers, entertainers, some who are sort of gender fluid. So I was thinking, in the 80s, there was 70s and 80s, David Bowie, the 80s, Annie Lennox. And, further back, I had not realized how, Marlene Dietrich really was just
Yes.
parading around in a tuxedo, singing in a deep voice, and I think even kissed a woman in some 1930s film. So
Yeah.
I think sometimes we are convinced that because things were not allowed to surface as much as they are now, that these things didn't exist. But you see glimpses of it in pre-World War II Berlin too. There was obviously a lot of that whole was it the Berlin Tales by Christopher Isherwood? A lot of gender fluidity and that got turned into cabaret.
Yeah. I mean, and you see some of that, and then we have the reaction, and the extreme reaction to allowing this kind of, presentation into the norm, which it should be. People are what they are, and their natural, genuine expression is beautiful. And so I really liked seeing that in this. And, and a lot of times, like, I work with a lot of material from the 90s, and sometimes this kind of representation isn't great, and so to see that in something from the 90s, I'm like, oh God, that feels nice, and Desire is, as much as they are, kind of feared and clearly scheming and up to shit. At the same time, Desire is simply doing what Desire does. Desire is simply living out their mission as was given to them. They are being themselves, and part of that is creating that sense of longing and desire in people and in apparently anthropomorphized concepts, because death and dream are also afraid of desire.
And I've just recently, I think, discovered that it is the desire for something, the anticipation, that produces the release of endorphins. So whether it's, somebody in love or an addict, seeing that cup of coffee about to be served to them, the biggest rush of endorphins comes just before consummation of caffeine.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that. But I mean, also, like, I think Desire's getting played a little dirty here. Like, without Desire, the creative impulse, right, would be gone, because we desire having created something. We desire a thing, so we make it. And the creative impulse, I think, in humanity is incredibly sacred, So, I don't know if Desire is ever going to get any credit for any of that. As far as this story goes, because we seem pretty firmly on the side of, Desire is bad news. But I think Desire deserves a little credit, because it is because of Desire. It is because of things we want that do not exist that we create, and I think that that's a sacred impulse. Another thing here, and we can touch on this a little bit, we talked about it a little bit already, is the Corinthian, who is set up as our story arc villain. And as I say that, I just want to, add some clarity that a villain is not the same thing as an antagonist. Protagonist wants something, the antagonist blocks them from getting it. That sets up the central narrative conflict. That's how stories are told. But heroes and villains don't necessarily map to protagonists and antagonists. That has to do with good and bad, and protagonists and antagonists are absolutely morally neutral. So when I say that the Corinthian is clearly our villain, clearly our bad guy, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Corinthian is going to be blocking Rose or is going to be playing the role of the antagonist. So often we try to map protagonist to hero and antagonist to villain, but it doesn't have to work that way. I love the idea that here we have Corinthian as an anthropomorphized nightmare. He is not accounted for in the dream world. And when the census comes in, that we're missing 4 of the major arcana, right? And who it is who's gone and what they are and what they represent, and that the nightmare is the one that we're all like, oh no, that thing got out, right? And then we see him in the end, just terrifying a young sex worker in a hotel room bathroom, it's pretty horrifying. Like, we are seriously still in this horror space. And I know that we were talking about the transition from horror to fantasy. And like that, I thought that was coming in this one. I think maybe I'm going to have to wait for a little while for that full transition. Or are we always going to have like this element of horror? It's just that the balance maybe leans a little more toward the fantasy.
Yes, I think it's that there's always going to be elements of horror. You know, with the Corinthian, I want to say this. It's a little bit of a spoiler. Should I say this or not?
I think so. Okay, everybody skip ahead 30 seconds if you don't like spoilers.
So when I was talking to Neil about the Corinthian, I mentioned, I don't know why this came in, but I had been a really big fan of Dune. And I think it was during a period when people were not talking about Dune, which they are again because of the upcoming movie. And I, as a kid, like I read all the Dune books, even the ones that do not deserve to be read. But one of the things I really loved was the character of Duncan Idaho. And he is a Ghola, Ghola. And I'm not going to say anything more, but Neil talked about that as an aspect in his thought process.
Ooh, interesting.
So it's sort of a teaser spoiler. It's a Gypsy Rose Lee of a spoiler.
Okay. All right. I like it. Okay. So now we're going into Lucien's library, which, as everybody has been told and warned, this is more spoiled. We're getting a little bit more behind the scenes kind of feel for what's going on. So what do you have in your Lucien's library segment for us today?
Well, like a hanging pheasant, sometimes a spoil just enriches the meat.
It does. It does. I don't believe that spoilers ruin a good story. I have a policy about spoilers. I am not spoiler sensitive, but I know that some people are, and I try to respect that. But I think that a good story, like I read Pride and Prejudice once a year. I know that Darcy and Elizabeth get together. That does not take away the joy of that experience for me. So anyway, a good story is a lot harder to spoil. But anyway, go ahead.
It's very true. Okay, so one of the first things is I believe we found, I've moved a couple of times recently, and so I had to re-find my copy of Sandman, King of Dreams, which was a book I wrote in 2003 about the Sandman. And back then, things were fresher in my mind. I'd done a bunch of interviews with Neil, too, to refresh. So in the book, I talked about the fact that with The Doll's House, while Mike Dringenberg and Malcolm Jones III were working on this storyline, I believe that Chris Bachalo, who was then a new artist, became really a big star in his own right, and Michael Zulli were either soon after or already working on their issues. And this is a trick that editors will use to do a fill-in, so you can have two artists basically working at the same time, and you can slot in something by another artist. It buys the main team a little more time. So we're going to see, I think it's next issue that's going to be Chris Bachalo's, and we'll get to Michael Zulli's up ahead. So I just wanted to mention that was happening in the background. This was a monthly book. I mean, we struggle to get our podcast done every week, but producing a monthly book, that's
the whole thing. Yeah.
Quite an accomplishment. So the other thing I wanted to mention is in the book, I found a letter from Neil to Karen. And I'm going to see if it's so funny because it's reproduced here and it looks like some ancient computer artifact. So this was a letter from Neil in response to let's see if I can get it so I can read it and not knock the microphone, as I love to do. So this was a letter from Neil back to Karen in response to some editorial comments. Dear Karen, okay, let's go over your questions. 1. What does our lead character do to show you fear in a handful of dust? It's a number of things. You've correctly pointed to a couple, the majesty of his character, the fact that this is the Lord of Nightmares. I suppose, though, that for me, the third factor is his inhumanity. He is the lord of his realm, and as he will say at some point, Not fair? Of course it's not fair. There is no fairness and no justice here. There's just me. He can plunge you into nightmare or into dreams, but often gradually, so the person being plunged and the reader hardly know what's happening at first. He is scary. He inspires awe, and he can inspire fear. Also in dreams, he changes shape. He could be a black cat with eyes of flame, or a shadow, or a house. So I'm just gonna, I won't read the whole thing right here, but one of the other things which I loved, point number 5, I obviously didn't make myself clear, my fault, about his trappings. You can take away a calculator from someone without taking away their ability to do arithmetic. You may slow them up a lot, and they may be rusty. There may even be ways to do calculations they've forgotten how to do without a calculator. But that doesn't mean they are magically helpless without one. And so I thought that really clarified what the ruby had been. So that was just
I like it.
Little bit of...
Okay, and also, okay, pardon me, but what the fuck? Like, even his letters are beautifully composed. Like, if somebody read my emails, they would be misspelled, half sentences. Nothing makes any sense.
Well, he was writing this to Karen Berger, who was, a magical and awe-inspiring creature herself. So he was probably wanting to be eloquent.
That's very nicely written, for a letter between two people,
And the last thing I wanted to say for my Lucien's library is I studied at Wesleyan with the science fiction writer Kit Reed. I was really lucky. She was an amazing writer and mentor to me. And I stayed in touch with her, all through the years. She gave me some really good advice in college, which I didn't take. And the advice was, do not combine your writing with cigarettes or drinking or any other vices, because you will eventually want to quit. And it will become a lot harder to write. So at the time that I began working at DC, Neil was still smoking Marlboros. And it's so hard. He became so health conscious. It's still astonishing to me. But I was a smoker too. I am embarrassed to say what I smoked. It was so embarrassing.
What did you smoke?
Oh God, I can't.
I was a Marlboro Lights girl.
Yeah, that's fine. No,
what were you smoking? Like Camels? What were you smoking?
No, it's more embarrassing.
Viceroy?
No, I can't talk about it. It was like the most 70s, 80s stupid ass cigarette.
I'm so fascinated to know. I used to work in a grocery store, so I knew I remember the Parliaments that had like the little plastic filter and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Here's the thing.
I've smoked everything at least once.
If you define a person by their cigarette choices, I just don't want people to think of me as a Virginia Slims ultralight.
I knew I was going to say Virginia Slims. I knew it.
So anyway, I remember that I was trying to quit and I had so much trouble writing. And then I said something to Neil about it. He's like, oh yeah, no, I quit. I said, you quit? You just quit and you just kept on writing on the monthly schedule? He's like, oh yeah. I said, how did you do it? He said, oh, well, they didn't have my brand. I was somewhere they didn't have my particular brand of Marlboros. So he was just like, screw it. If they don't have my particular brand, and he seemed to quit without any effort. And it is,
oh my goodness,
just one of those things. But when I look at these earlier issues of The Doll's House, I see people smoking and I see the Miranda, the mother, saying, like, oh, thank God, getting off the flight, having a cigarette. So I wonder if I don't think there is as much smoking in comics or TV or movies, because I don't think writers are smoking as much anymore.
Maybe not. Yeah, that's interesting. But I just want to say really quickly before we continue this discussion that you've come a long way, baby. For those youngsters out there, that was the Virginia Slims tagline.
I will show you embarrassment and a handful of cigarette butts.
But yeah, no, that's really interesting. This idea of not associating something that you may have to quit with your writing. One of the things in the teaching that I do is I tell people to have things that they associate, that they only use. Like, I had a friend who wore a hat, had a particular writing hat, and only wore it when he wrote. A particular writing socks, a candle, a scented candle that is a particular scent that you use only when you write.
I need to do this.
Music. Yeah, no, I'm telling you, music that because here's the thing. You associate things very strongly. Have you ever had a moment where you walk into a store and there's a whiff of perfume that like your, second grade teacher had worn or that you wore when you were younger, and it brings you right back and you have such clarity over that moment. Soundtracks are really great for that, for writing, that you have a soundtrack of music that you have not listened to before you started that book and you just listen to it when you're thinking about that book. I still have songs that I used for books I wrote 15 years ago that if I go into like Walmart and they play it on the thing, I am instantly and so clearly back in that book. So by having things, specific things, sigils, if you will, that you associate with the particular work that you're working on, it has that powerful connection. And I can absolutely see where drinking and smoking and these vices that someday we all say, hey, we're going to quit. When you do that, throwing like a spanner in the works for your ability to sit down and write. Absolutely. But I highly recommend, though, the strategy of associating particular things, because that's the kind of thing that can help you with writer's block. Just knowing that you've got this thing that is a symbol of your writing, and you have written with, wearing those fuzzy slippers for these 20 years or whatever, it can be really, really powerful. So for the writers out there, there's a reverse angle on that association that can really, really work for you.
I love it. I'm going to become vavasour of my own dominion this way.
Absolutely.
I did a lot of looking up of words for this issue.
I love it. All right. So, Alisa, what's your favorite page in this one?
Oh, gosh. I'm a Three Witches junkie. The double page spread. I just really love them. I love the fact that the updated hairdo for Cynthia was, sort of 80s do, which now has probably come back in fashion. I love the design of it. I love the way the crone's face becomes almost a skull, the way the owl eyes are worked in. It's just an incredible spread. By the way, I am not sure, but I was looking at an old EC Comics horror title, and they had a character called the Old Witch. And she also has that sort of really large eye. And I'm kind of wondering if this witch, was originally, which is, again, from the DC 70s title, was modeled or borrowed from the EC version. But anyway, that is my favorite page. What about you?
Oh, I love Lucienne running through in the little slivers of all of these places in the dreaming in that one, page that is side printed, so you have to turn the book sideways in order to read it, and first of all, Lucienne, I haven't seen a lot of Lucienne. But I feel such love for Lucienne. Lucienne, the one who tallies and counts and keeps the books and like all of these things. Like I love Lucienne. If I was living in the dreaming, I would want to be Lucienne's personal assistant. Like that would be kind of the job I would really love to have. Because there's something about the keeper of the knowledge in a place that has where everything is ephemeral and shifting, that he has a handle on it. There's something about that I love. I think Lucienne's kind of hot. I'm not going to lie. So I love all of these places that he's going through. We see him at a hobbit hole. There's this knight down at the bottom. There's I don't know what might be a mermaid holding a mannequin. Not sure what's going on there, but it's so interesting. A hall with eyes over the door, which I kind of love. This long, dark blue and black subway track, so cool looking. It's so interesting. And I love, again, that so much world building and extensions of this world that are in these. And am I ever going to see any of those places? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But it's really interesting.
It is. Lucienne always seemed to me like a Roddy McDowall character. Roddy McDowall used to always play that role of the really sweet, earnest,
Yeah, British butler-esque, dude. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think there is anyone who quite fills the Roddy McDowell. Is there a new Roddy McDowell? There isn't really.
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
We need
I don't think
a
so,
new
but yeah.
Roddy McDowell.
I mean, Giles from Buffy, maybe to a certain extent, but not really.
He was
a
little too solid. I don't know.
A little too. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. All right. That maybe people will tell us. Well, I think what's really funny here, though, is that my favorite page is like, I think linked with your favorite part, and my favorite part is so we are
so we just kind of reversed them.
Yeah, we're becoming each other. So
so your favorite part?
My favorite part is again the Lucien where he spots that Rose. Except Rose is us. We are in her point of view. And it feels as though a wall has been broken, but, in a way that just makes the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
It's so very cool. Yeah. And my favorite part is the three women, the witches. Like, I love the witches, I love we have a take on that in The Weird Sisters for Terry Pratchett, which I've always really enjoyed. For a while, I had a series, like I'd have hard drives, extensible hard drives to carry all my data. And they were named Weatherwax, Og, and McGrath. So like, I'm into the three witches. I love the triple goddess idea. And so it's really fun to see them show up. And then and I love this too, where they're like, you didn't ask us the right question. You should be asking us the right question. And I can understand that, kind of sense of I am trying to help you here, and that was really, really fun. I enjoyed them a lot.
But they are funny. I don't know if they are entirely trying to help. You always get the feeling that they are, they are amusing themselves at humans' expenses. In the much underrated 90s miniseries, The 10th Kingdom, there's the heroine wanders into a swamp and the fairies spot her and they say, "Oh, would you like to be reunited with your dad?" And, the heroine says, "Yes, please." And one of the fairies says, "No, it's my turn to be naughty." And, there's that link between fairies and the devil. And I feel there's something about the three witches that they will warn her, but they delight in, as I delight in the elliptical tease, they delight in not answering the question that Rose really needs answered.
Yeah, well, there is a trickster energy. Like usually we see trickster energy in these like male-coded characters, But I think the three witches have some trickster energy of their own, which is a lot of fun to play with. So I'm enjoying, whenever I see them, I always enjoy that. All right. If you enjoyed this conversation, would like to join in, connect with the show on Twitter, follow @Chipperish and use the hashtag #EndlessPodcast, or send your comments or questions to endless@chipperish.com.
This episode of Endless was brought to you by the Chipperish Media producers who support us on Patreon at the power producer level. These people are the reason why Endless is coming to you free and ad-free right now, so thank you to Abby, Alice, Christina, Erica, Jonathan, Kevin, Kristen, Michael, Rose, Sarah, Shelley, Stephania, and Stephanie. And this week's special message for our power producers: perhaps one of our problems may prove a solution to the other.
To find out how you too can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support: write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, or hide in a closet split into 3 versions of yourself, just waiting for Rose to walk in so you can drop some strange knowledge on her. Because, what else are you going to do on a random Tuesday, am I right?
This episode of Endless was edited by Chipperish content editor Jack Cram. Jack, we can only caution you, my posy, my puppet. We can't protect you. We will be back next time with Sandman issue 11, Moving In. Until then, are we not endless, Queen of Despair? Yes, we wait.